The Zykar Empire was known across the galaxy as the most advanced race. They ruled with arrogance, their ships sleek and powerful, their weapons capable of annihilating entire fleets with a single blast. No one dared challenge them, no one except Earth. When the Zykar first laid eyes on Earth's ships, they couldn't help but laugh. The humans' fleet was a patchwork of old battleships, ships that were barely held together with rust and desperation. Pathetic, the Zykar commanders mocked, sneering at the view of the dilapidated fleet. The Zykar believed they were unstoppable. Their technology was light years ahead of anything Earth could muster. It was only a matter of time before the Earthlings fell, just like every other race that had dared to defy them. And yet, as the Zykar fleet approached Earth, their arrogance clouded their judgment. Captain Emily Harris stood at the helm of Titan's Fury, Earth's last line of defense. The ship had no business being in this fight. It was an outdated relic, barely operational and far too slow. It was made from parts scavenged from old warships, its hull covered in patches and scorch marks from years of combat. The crew was inexperienced, a mix of young soldiers and engineers who had volunteered in the wake of Earth's desperate call for help. As the Zykar ships loomed closer, Harris gripped the command chair, her knuckles white. She knew the odds were against them. The Zykar had numbers, firepower, and advanced weapons that Earth could never dream of matching. Still, there was one thing they didn't understand. Humanity wasn't known for giving up. "Ready all systems," Captain Harris ordered, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The crew worked quickly, their movements synchronized despite the chaos surrounding them. On the comms, the voice of Lieutenant Daniels, the ship's weapons officer, crackled through. "Captain, we're locked onto the Zykar flagship, but it's not even a challenge for them. They'll tear us apart in seconds." "Not if we don't give them that satisfaction," Harris replied, her eyes narrowing with determination. "Stay calm, stay focused. We're going to give them something they never expected." The Zykar fleet had already begun their assault, massive energy blasts lighting up the space around them. Titan's Fury was a sitting target, slow and vulnerable. Harris knew that if they didn't act fast, they'd be destroyed before they even had a chance to fight back. But just as the first blast from the Zykar fleet hit the edge of Earth's atmosphere, something incredible happened. Titan's Fury lurched to the side, narrowly avoiding the shot that should have obliterated it. The ship's engines roared to life, pushing the battered vessel into a sharp turn. In the blink of an eye, it dodged another blast, this time narrowly skimming the edge of the Zykar flagship's weapons range. The Zykar couldn't believe their eyes. The humans had done something they never expected. Titan's Fury was moving with speed and agility that defied its outdated design. It was as if the ship had a mind of its own, moving faster than anyone could have anticipated. The Zykar fleet hesitated for a split second. In that brief moment, the humans on board Titan's Fury made their move. The ship fired back. One shot, one direct hit on a Zykar destroyer. The blast ripped through its shields, sending shockwaves through the Zykar ranks. The Zykar ships staggered, their commanders stunned. A few moments ago, they had been certain this would be a simple conquest. Now, their confidence was shaken. "Direct hit, Captain," Lieutenant Daniel shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. "We've got their attention," Harris said, her voice calm. But inside, her heart was racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Titan's Fury wasn't supposed to survive, but it had. And now, it had made the Zykar take notice. The battle had only just begun, but the tide had already shifted. The Zykar were used to fighting races that would crumble in the face of their might. But humanity was different. Humans didn't give up when the odds were stacked against them. They didn't back down when faced with certain defeat. And now, the Zykar were learning the hard way that Earth would not fall easily. As Titan's Fury continued to weave through the chaos of the battle, firing its weapons with deadly precision, Captain Harris felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could win this fight. But the Zykar wouldn't stop. and neither would the humans. The war for Earth had begun, and no one, not even the most advanced empire in the galaxy, could have predicted what would come next. For the first time in a long time, the Zakar had underestimated humanity, and they would soon learn that this was a mistake they would never live to regret. The Zakar fleet had never experienced a challenge like this. In the blink of an eye, Titan's fury had dodged multiple incoming blasts, and in return, it delivered a powerful strike that left the Zakar flagship staggering. What had begun as a battle that seemed hopeless for humanity had suddenly shifted the balance, at least for a moment. But for Captain Emily Harris and her crew, the true test had just begun. As the first wave of chaos settled, Captain Harris stood motionless at the helm of Titan's Fury, her eyes scanning the space before them. Her heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced to process the reality of what had just happened. The battle had barely started, yet they had already done the impossible. But Harris knew that the Zakar Empire wasn't one to back down easily. If anything, this attack would only fuel their anger and determination. "Captain," Lieutenant Daniels's voice crackled through the comms. "We've got company coming in fast. At least 5 more Zakar warships on intercept course." Harris didn't hesitate. She knew the Zakar would retaliate, and when they did, they would come at full force. The ship Titan's Fury might have defied the odds once, but they couldn't keep dodging like this forever. "Brace for impact," Harris ordered, her voice steady, "and get us into position for another strike. We're not running." The crew worked in a synchronized frenzy. The old ship, though slow and outdated, had been retrofitted with human ingenuity. While the Zakar focused on their advanced technology, the humans had focused on adaptability, filling their ship with every trick, every ounce of creativity that could make the difference in a desperate fight like this. Titan's Fury was a fighter, not by design, but by the sheer will of those who commanded it. But even as Harris commanded, she knew they were fighting against the clock. The Zakar were known for their ruthless efficiency, their weapons capable of obliterating an entire fleet in seconds. If they wanted to survive, Titan's Fury had to keep moving, keep surprising the enemy. The first of the Zakar warships arrived within firing range, and the comms crackled with the cold, calculating voice of the Zakar commander. "Human ship, surrender now or face annihilation." Harris stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "Not today." The crew braced themselves as Harris locked her eyes on the view screen. The incoming blasts from the Zakar warship were massive, each one lighting up the blackness of space like a star on the verge of exploding. For a brief moment, it seemed like there was no way they could dodge the attacks. Yet Captain Harris knew there was only one thing they could do. "Turn us hard to port," Harris shouted. The ship groaned as the engines pushed the ship to the side, narrowly avoiding the first blast. Another missile zoomed past, missing by mere inches. But Titan's Fury was a ship of fire and fury, and it wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. "Firing on my mark," Harris said, her finger hovering over the trigger. Her crew, tense and waiting for her signal, looked to her for direction. "Mark," she shouted. The ship shuddered as the weapons fired, the first salvo of missiles screaming toward the approaching Zakar warship. The explosion lit up the night like a comet, sending a shockwave that rattled Titan's Fury and nearly knocked the crew off their feet. The Zakar warship took the full brunt of the strike, its shields flickering before finally failing under the intense assault. "We've hit them." Lieutenant Daniels's voice rang through the comms, full of disbelief. "Direct hit. Their shields are down." Harris's eyes narrowed. They had done it again. "Prepare for another volley," she ordered, her heart racing. But she knew their advantage wouldn't last long. The Zakar would adapt, just as they always did. They had underestimated Earth before, but now the stakes had changed. The Zakar would be coming at them with everything they had. Seconds later, a loud boom echoed through the ship. The vibration rattled through Titan's Fury's hull, and for a brief moment, the entire ship seemed to shudder under the force of it. Harris's eyes snapped to the view screen, her heart pounding. "Captain, "They've hit our starboard engines," shouted Ensign Lee, her voice tinged with panic. "We've lost power to 2 of the engines. We can't maneuver as fast as before." The Zykar were relentless. They had finally struck a vulnerable point on Titan's fury. And now the ship was slowing down, unable to move as quickly or dodge the incoming attacks as it had before. The damage was mounting, and Harris could see the ship's outer hull beginning to crack under the pressure. The crew worked feverishly, trying to restore power to the damaged systems, but Harris knew they didn't have much time. "Damage control teams to starboard engine room," Harris ordered, the tension in her voice betraying her calm demeanor. "All hands, hold steady. We're not giving up now." But even as they scrambled to hold the ship together, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was shifting. The Zykar, relentless in their pursuit, would soon be upon them, and if they didn't find a way to strike back, Titan's fury might not survive the next wave. The fight was far from over, and the question on Harris's mind was simple: could humanity overcome an enemy so far beyond their own technological reach? The battered Titan's fury drifted in space, its systems faltering, its hull scared and smoking from the relentless onslaught of the Zykar Empire. The Zykar ships were closing in, their sleek, deadly forms surrounding the human vessel like sharks circling a wounded prey. The crew had given everything they had, and yet their survival still hung in the balance. Captain Emily Harris stood frozen at the helm, her fingers clutching the cold metal of the control panel as the ship groaned beneath her. She could feel the vibrations through her boots as the wounded vessel fought to stay alive. But the energy readings flickered weakly on the screen in front of her. Titan's fury was running out of power. "Captain, we've lost all forward propulsion." Ensign Lee's voice crackled through the comms, tinged with frustration. "The backup engines are failing. We can't outrun them." "Damn it," Harris muttered under her breath. The Zykar would be on them in moments. Their weapons were powerful enough to tear apart Titan's fury in a single shot, and she couldn't run. The ship's engines were dead, and she had no more tricks up her sleeve. But then something unexpected happened. A faint signal broke through the static. "Captain," Lieutenant Daniels's voice cut through the tension. "I'm reading something strange. There's a power surge coming from the auxiliary reactor." Harris's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. The auxiliary reactor was barely functional, a patched-up system that had only been kept alive by the crew's ingenuity. It wasn't supposed to generate power in the way Daniels was describing. "Explain, Lieutenant," Harris demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the rising panic in her chest. Daniels's fingers flew across his console as he analyzed the readings. "It's like the reactor is amplifying the remaining energy in the ship's systems. It's as if something triggered it to overdrive." Overdrive. The word struck Harris like a lightning bolt. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She remembered the old war stories her grandfather used to tell her about last-ditch efforts, desperation-driven plans that defied logic. Could this be one of those moments? "Keep me updated, Daniels," she ordered, eyes scanning the view screen. The Zykar ships were getting closer. They could almost taste the victory. Suddenly, another voice rang through the intercom. "Captain, we've got incoming," shouted Lieutenant Miller, her voice shaking. "At least 4 ships in firing range, and they're charging weapons." The battle was about to escalate, and they were on the losing side. Harris clenched her fists, her mind racing for a solution. The ship was barely functional, her crew was exhausted, and the Zykar fleet was overwhelming. "All hands, prepare for final combat positions," Harris ordered, her voice now a calm, unshakable command. She turned back to Daniels. "Lieutenant, whatever that surge is, I need it to work now." Daniels nodded, his face tight with concentration. "Understood, Captain. Engaging auxiliary reactor overdrive now." Harris's heart hammered in her chest as the ship shuddered once more. The rumbling in the walls grew louder, as if Titan's fury itself was waking up. Then, with a jolt that nearly threw Harris from her feet, The ship surged forward, its systems flickering back to life. Titan's fury wasn't just moving, it was gaining speed. The auxiliary reactor, somehow, was pushing the ship beyond its normal limitations. The power coursing through the ship's systems reignited its offensive capabilities, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the human vessel felt like a force to be reckoned with. "Captain, the main cannon's online," Daniel shouted, his voice filled with excitement. "We've got a shot at them." Harris's eyes gleamed with a newfound determination. "Fire everything we've got." The Zykar fleet, unaware of the sudden change, was closing in fast. Harris gritted her teeth as the weapon systems powered up. The ship's main cannon, the weapon that had always been considered too old and outdated to be effective, charged to full power. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The hum of the reactor, the tension in the air, the creeping approach of the Zykar warships. Then, with a flash of brilliant light, the first blast from Titan's fury exploded across space, slamming into the closest Zykar ship with bone-crushing force. The Zykar vessel's shields flickered and failed under the strike, the explosion sending a shockwave that rocked the remaining enemy ships. The sight was almost surreal. Titan's fury, a ship everyone had written off, a ship that should have never stood a chance, was now fighting back with the fury of a beast cornered. "We've done it," Lieutenant Daniel shouted, a mix of relief and disbelief in his voice. But Harris wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. The Zykar were powerful, and even with the element of surprise, this was far from over. The remaining ships would retaliate, and the surge from the reactor wouldn't last forever. "Get ready for another barrage," Harris commanded, not giving her crew a moment to relax. "This isn't over. Not yet." As the Zykar ships regrouped, preparing their own counterattack, Captain Harris steeled herself for what was to come. They had struck a blow, but the battle was only just beginning. Titan's fury was still a ship on the edge of destruction, but for the first time in this fight, the Zykar might have begun to realize something. Humanity wasn't going down without a fight. And Titan's fury was the proof. The Titan's fury groaned as it struggled to maintain its momentum. The Zykar ships, though reeling from the surprise attack, were already regrouping. The human ship had struck a blow, but the war was far from over. Harris could feel the weight of their dwindling power supply pressing down on her like a vice. The auxiliary reactor had given them a burst of energy, but it wasn't sustainable. Every system, every circuit, was at the brink of collapse. "Captain, we're losing power to the shields," shouted Lieutenant Daniels, his voice thick with panic. "We can't take another hit like that." Harris's heart raced. The Zykar had regrouped and were now surrounding them. They were ready to retaliate, and the Titan's fury was sitting in the middle of it all. Vulnerable, barely able to defend itself. There was no time for hesitation. She needed to think fast, or they would all be dead. "Can we restore power to the shields?" Harris asked, her voice calm but firm. Daniels nodded, though it was clear he didn't believe it would work. "We could try, if we reroute energy from the weapon systems to the shield generators, but we lose our firepower." "Do it," Harris commanded. "We're not out of this fight yet." There was no time for second guesses. They had to buy themselves time. The Zykar ships were moving in, their weapons primed for a devastating strike. But the Titan's fury was human-made, and humans didn't give up. They never gave up. "Shields were routed, Captain," Daniel said, his voice steady but strained. "But it's not going to hold for long." The Titan's fury flickered, the shields now emitting a faint, glowing aura around the ship. They wouldn't last long, but for now, they were their only defense. The Zykar ships closed in, their weapons charging, their confident sneers evident even through the communication channels. "Captain Harris," the voice of the Zykar leader crackled over the comms. His voice was smooth, almost mocking. "You fought bravely, but it's time to accept the inevitable. You're outmatched. Surrender now, and we might spare your lives." Refuse, and we will annihilate you." The words were cold, but Harris had heard enough. She had seen too many lives lost to let these monsters think they could scare her into submission. She clenched her jaw, her hands gripping the controls with newfound resolve. "Not today," she muttered under her breath. Harris turned back to her crew. "Prepare to fire on my command. Full power to the main cannon." The crew members nodded, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. They were tired, battered, but they had come too far to let it end now. They had to believe that they could still win. Even against an enemy as powerful as the Zykar, they had proven they weren't weak. They were humans, and humans fought back. The Zykar ships were closing in, their weapons primed to deliver the final blow. They were confident that the Titan's fury would fall in moments. They thought it was over, but they had underestimated humanity's will to survive. "Fire!" Harris shouted, slamming her fist down on the console. The Titan's fury roared back to life. The main cannon fired with a power that shook the ship to its core, its brilliant beam cutting through the void of space. The shot struck one of the Zykar ships with a resounding explosion, tearing through its shields and leaving a massive hole in its hull. For a moment, there was silence. The Zykar fleet had underestimated the human ship. They had thought it was a failure, a last-ditch attempt that would never stand a chance. But they were wrong. The Titan's fury had proven that humanity wasn't a species to be underestimated. The Zykar ship that had been struck was now drifting in space, a burning wreck, and it was just the beginning. Harris's heart pounded as the crew cheered. They had just turned the tide in their favor, but the battle wasn't over. The remaining Zykar ships were still a threat, and they were angrier than ever. "Captain, they're retreating," Lieutenant Daniel said, his voice filled with disbelief. "We've damaged their fleet. They're falling back." Harris didn't allow herself to breathe a sigh of relief just yet. The Zykar were ruthless, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. But for the first time, it felt like they had a chance. The Titan's fury had defied expectations once again. As the Zykar ships began to retreat, Harris couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could win this. It wasn't the Titan's fury that had saved them. It was the crew, the people aboard this battered ship who had refused to surrender. "They won't be gone for long," Harris said, her voice low but filled with determination. "Prepare for another round. We're not done yet." The crew nodded in unison. They had proven themselves, and they were ready to do it again. The Titan's fury wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of humanity's will to fight, to survive, and to defy the impossible. And as long as the Titan's fury was still standing, so was humanity. The Zykar had retreated, but it was clear that they were regrouping, ready to strike again. The Titan's fury was battered and barely holding together, and the crew was running on fumes. They had taken down one Zykar ship, but the cost had been high. The shields were offline, the weapons systems were damaged, and their resources were running out fast. Yet, Captain Harris knew they couldn't afford to retreat. They had made their stand, and now they had to finish what they started. "Captain," Daniel said, his voice low, "the Zykar fleet is pulling back, but they've launched reinforcements. More ships are on the way." Harris stared at the holo display in front of her. The numbers were grim. The human fleet was small, and the Titan's fury was the only ship that had shown any real resistance. The Zykar were relentless. They would return, and when they did, they would come in greater numbers. "What's our status on power?" Harris asked. "We got enough to keep the engines running for another hour, maybe two," Daniels replied. "But the weapons are only partially functional, and the reactor's overheating." "We can't afford to wait for another hour," Harris muttered under her breath. The Zykar would strike soon, and she needed a plan. As she paced, her mind raced. They didn't have the luxury of time, and they certainly didn't have the firepower to win a prolonged battle. She turned to her crew. "Listen up, everyone. We've got one shot at this. The The Zykar are overconfident. They believe we're done, and they think they can wipe us out easily. They're wrong. We've already proven that. Lieutenant Daniels looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. What's the plan, Captain? We're going to make them believe we have more than we do, Harris said, her voice sharp with determination. We're going to hit them hard, make them think we're still fighting at full strength. She paused, looking around at the crew. They were tired, so tired, but they all knew that they had one mission: to protect Earth, to survive. Prepare all remaining weapons. I want every shot to count. We'll use our remaining power for a surprise attack. Hit them with everything we've got when they come close enough. No second chances. Understood, Captain, Daniel said, his voice steady. The crew quickly moved into action, working as fast as they could to prepare for what might be their last stand. Outside the ship, the stars gleamed coldly, indifferent to the struggle that was unfolding in their midst. The Titan's fury drifted in space, barely functional, but still dangerous. It was the heart of humanity's defiance. Harris stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the approaching Zykar fleet. There were more ships now, at least 5, possibly more. She could see their advanced weapons systems powering up. The odds were against them, but Harris had never been one to back down. Not when her crew was counting on her. Not when Earth was depending on her. Captain, Daniel said, his voice tense, they're getting closer. They'll be in range in 5 minutes. Harris took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Brace for impact, she ordered, her voice calm but firm. Prepare for the final strike. We fight now, or we die. The crew braced themselves, their faces grim but determined. They had survived against the odds once before. Now they would do it again, or die trying. The Zykar ships were closing in, their weapons charging. The Titan's fury was outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered, but they had one advantage: the element of surprise. The Zykar didn't expect a second attack. They believed they had won. That was their mistake. As the first Zykar ship entered firing range, Harris's fingers danced over the controls. The Titan's fury came alive, its systems firing up one last time, pushing the ship to its limits. The main cannon hummed with power, and the smaller weapon systems powered up in rapid succession. Fire! Harris shouted, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. The Titan's fury fired, the cannon roaring with a brilliant flash of light that cut through the darkness of space. The shot hit the Zykar ship squarely in its weak spot, an explosion that sent shockwaves through the surrounding vessels. The enemy fleet faltered, their ships spinning out of formation as they tried to regain control. The human crew cheered, but Harris knew this was just the beginning. The Zykar wouldn't give up so easily. They would retaliate, harder, faster, stronger. But they hadn't counted on humanity's spirit, on the will to fight, no matter the odds. The Titan's fury fired again, striking another Zykar ship. This time, the explosion was massive, tearing the ship in two. The Zykar fleet was reeling, but the human ship was running on fumes, barely holding together. We've got no time left, Daniel said urgently. They're calling for reinforcements. We won't last much longer. Then we make this count, Harris replied. Fire everything we've got. The Titan's fury roared once more, sending a final devastating barrage into the heart of the remaining Zykar ships. The enemy fleet was on the verge of collapse. Harris felt a surge of hope, a feeling that they might just pull through. But she knew better than to let her guard down. The Zykar would regroup, and they would come back stronger. Captain, Daniels called out, his voice filled with relief. They're retreating. The rest of the fleet's pulling back. Harris didn't celebrate. She knew that the Zykar would return, but for now, they had won. The Titan's fury had survived. Humanity had survived. And for the first time in a long while, Harris allowed herself a moment of hope. The war wasn't over, but they had made their mark. The Zycar would never forget the day they underestimated humanity.